Welcome to the exam prep for the AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator exam. This is one of the most in-demand Azure certifications out there, and passing it proves you can manage identities governance, storage, compute, and networking in Azure. Whether you're brand new to Azure or have been working with it for a while, this series will help you sharpen your focus on what really matters for exam day. Let's get started. I'm Georgia, a lead technical trainer at Microsoft and author who loves making cloud concepts simple, practical, and fun to learn. I spent years as a Microsoft AI MVP and international speaker, working in cloud technologies, AI, and cybersecurity, and specializing in designing and implementing secure and scalable solutions. This exam is designed for those with hands-on experience managing Azure environments, with familiarity with Azure interfaces, and ideally, some training through Microsoft Learn. The practice tests and labs listed here are gold for your prep. Think of this exam prep as your final review. This video series is your comprehensive guide to exam preparation, covering essential topics and providing valuable study resources. Once you feel confident in your understanding of the content, it is time to take the exam. Now let's get started. This slide breaks down the 5 objective domains on the AZ-104 exam and their weights. Notice that managing identities and governance and deploying and managing compute resources each carry 20 to 25%. That is nearly half the exam right there. Storage and networking each carry 15 to 20%, and monitoring rounds it out at 10 to 15. Every domain matters, but if you're short on time, prioritize the heavier weighted areas first. Now let's get started with the first domain and the skills it measures. In this exam prep, we're going to focus on 3 key things. First, helping you clearly understand what will be covered in the exam so there are no surprises. Second, giving you practical insights on how to prepare effectively based on what really matters. And third, helping you identify which concepts you should prioritize or revisit so you can focus your study time where you will make the biggest impact. Remember, this exam prep session is not a replacement for official Microsoft training or your hands-on experience. While we will guide you on what to expect in the exam, we won't teach the topics in detail. Use it to spot any knowledge gaps and focus your time and resources accordingly. Ask yourself, as we're going through the concept, if I was presented in the exam with a scenario, would I be able to answer how to apply the services effectively using the best practices? We are diving into our first major domain, managing Azure identities and governance. This covers Entra ID users and groups, access management, subscriptions, and governance tools like Azure Policy. This will test whether you understand how to manage identities and control access as an Azure administrator. Let's dive right in. Here is the full list of skills measured in the exam. You have got Entra ID user and group management, resource logs, tax, subscription, cost management, and so much more. Notice what is not here: no MFA, no conditional access, no Intune. Focus your study on what is listed. Not every item will appear on your exam, but any of them could. Creating users and groups in Entra ID is fundamental. For the exam, make sure you know the difference between cloud identities, directory synced identities, and guest users. It is important for any questions that you might be asked to understand how security groups help manage access to shared resources. You should also be comfortable navigating the Entra ID dashboard to create and manage both users and groups. The exam may test you on both portal-based and command-line approaches, so get familiar with both. Licensing in Entra ID is a must-know topic for the exam. Make sure you have a basic understanding of the differences between the different tiers, like Free P1, P2, and Entra Suite. Know which features require a premium license, like conditional access needing P1 or privileged identity management needing P2. It is also good to remember how to assign and unassign licenses and understand how group licensing inheritance works. This is the kind of detail that can show up in a question in the exam. When it comes to access, managing external users means inviting guest users to collaborate with your organization. They receive an invitation email they need to accept. For the exam, make sure you review the best practices around external user management, like using sponsors from external organizations to review access. Guest users are added to your directory, but come from outside your tenants. Understand this distinction is key for access control questions. After authentication comes authorization. Built-in Azure roles are important to know and understand for the exam, especially the big three. Owner has full access and can delegate, contributor can create and manage, but cannot grant access, and reader can only view. Make sure you have a good grasp of the difference between the Entra admin roles and Azure Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC, roles, and review a few of them before you take the exam. When multiple roles are assigned, permissions combine and are also inherited from different spokes. Always think least privilege when answering exam questions about role assignments. Each user should only have exactly the permissions they need to do their job. No more, no less. Role assignments happen at different scopes: management group, subscription, resource group, or resource. Permissions granted at a parent scope inherit down to the child scopes. For the exam, you need to understand how a security principle gets a role definition applied at a specific scope. Think about a scenario or use case like, if you have a reader at one level and contributor at another, what is the net result? Least privilege is always the guiding principle in the exam. Azure policy is how you enforce compliance across your Azure resources. It lets you create, assign, and manage policies that ensure resources stay compliant with your standard. The workflow is simple. Define the policy, its scope, and assign it, and then access compliance. Policies can be grouped into initiatives, and this is the suggested best practice for the exam. Even if you don't have many policies now, planning for the future is better by grouping them into initiatives. As soon as a policy is active, every resource is compliant. But how about the ones that we created before the policy was in effect? Think about these questions before you take the exam. It is important to know how policy and role-based access control work together. For example, you might have contributor access, but a policy blocks creating certain VM sizes or in certain regions. These are things that can be tested in the exam. Resource locks are your safety nets against accidental deletions. There are two types: delete locks and read-only locks. For the exam, know when to use locks versus Azure policy. So here's a tricky question. If a resource has a cannot delete lock, can you still move it? Understanding these nuances is important for the exam, but also for effective Azure administration. Resource groups are logical containers that hold related Azure resources, but they are very important when working with Azure. Every resource must belong to exactly one resource group, and groups cannot be nested or renamed. Resources within a group can span different regions. So for the exam, know the rules for moving resources between groups, since some services have specific limitations. Understanding these constraints will help you answer scenario-based questions confidently. Subscriptions define your level of access and serve as billing units and security boundaries. Make sure you know the different types for the exam: pay-as-you-go, enterprise agreement, trial, CSP. Each subscription can have one or more tenants, and creating your first Azure subscription can also create a new tenant and Entra ID. Organizations often use multiple subscriptions to avoid resource limits and improve governance and security. For the exam, it is important that you understand the relationship between subscriptions, tenants, and directories. And what about pricing? Cost management is about being smart with your Azure spending. For the exam, remember that costs are resource-specific and vary by location. Inbound and outbound data transfer costs also might differ. Use reserved instances to save money and leverage Azure Hybrid benefit for on-premises licenses. For the exam, know the permission level for cost alerts. Owner contributor and cost management contributor can read and update, while reader roles are read-only. And how do you handle multiple subscriptions? Management groups let you organize subscriptions into a hierarchy for policy and access control. They sit above subscriptions in the Azure hierarchy. You can define up to 6 levels deep with up to 10,000 groups per tenant. And each subscription belongs to exactly one management group. For the exam, know how permissions flow down this hierarchy and the roles required to move management groups. It would be a good idea to look through the Azure Architecture Center and review the best practices about planning the hierarchy, for example, by department or by environment. Here are some other skills that you might need to review that could be included in the exam. For example, resource tags, user properties, access management, and Entra ID features like service password reset. In this section, we covered managing Entra ID users and groups, managing access to Azure resources through role-based access control, and managing subscriptions and governance. These are foundational skills for any Azure administrator, and they're really important for the exam. If any of these topics felt unfamiliar, circle back and review them before moving on. Strong fundamentals here set you up for success in the rest of the exam. Now let's move on to a second domain, implementing and managing storage. This covers configuring access to storage, managing storage accounts, and working with Azure Files and blob storage. Storage questions in the exam make up 15 to 20%, so do not underestimate this section. Let us see what is involved. Here are all the skills measured in the exam. You have got storage firewalls, tokens, access policies, access keys, and so much more. Okay, it is a long list. But even though not every item will appear in your exam, any of them could. So keep an eye out for all of these. Let's start talking about Azure Storage Security. Storage firewalls and virtual network rules restrict access to your storage account from specific subnets or public IPs. You need to know the two types of endpoints, service endpoints and private endpoints. And remember for the exam that firewall rules only apply to data plane operations. Make sure for in exam questions, you understand how to grant access from a virtual network, an IP range, on-premises networks, and trusted Azure resources. It is important that you understand any requirements as well. For example, subnets and VNets must exist in the same Azure region or region pair as the storage account. These little configurations options might come up in any question. Shared Access Signature or SAS tokens grant delegated access to storage resources without sharing your account keys. For the exam, always remember all the types: user delegation, service and account SAS. Make sure you know the best practices as well. Always use HTTPS, prefer user delegation SAS when possible, because it's backed by Entra ID credentials and roles. Understanding when and how to use each type is essential for any security-focused questions in the exam. And the stored access policies give you extra control over your SAS tokens. You can set up to 5 policies per container, table, queue, or share. And when you update a policy, it can take up to 30 seconds to become active. During that window, some requests might get a 403 forbidden error. But they make it easier to revoke access by deleting or renaming the policy, so it makes it a very secure solution. Keep that in mind for the exam, as there are questions that take this into account, and sometimes it's easy to forget. Managing access keys is also about securing your storage account credentials. The best practice is to store keys in the Azure Key Vault and retrieve them at runtime instead of hard coding them in your app. You can also disallow this authorization entirely, which forces all requests to use Entra ID authentication at RBAC. For the exam, understand the implications of disabling shared key access and how Key Vault integrates with storage security. Now let's move to Azure Files. Azure Files is a fully managed cloud service that provides shared file storage in Azure, accessible via standard protocols like SMB and NFS, from both cloud and on-premises systems. For the exam, make sure you know the different access. For example, identity-based access for Azure files extend traditional file shares access to the cloud. Then you can enforce granular permissions and backup Windows ACLs along with your data. For the exam, make sure you know the restriction. Identity-based authentication is not supported with NFS shares. It's also good to keep in mind some common use cases that include replacing on-premises file servers and lift and shift scenarios. The exam may test you on when this approach is appropriate versus other access methods that are available. Storage redundancy, it's all about protecting your data. In the primary region, you choose between locally redundant storage and zone redundant storage. For cross-region protection, there's geo-redundant storage and geo-zone redundant storage with optional read access variants. For the exam, make sure you know the trade-offs between cost and availability and understand the factors that drive your redundancy choice. Replication, scope, regional disaster protection, and read access requirements. Can you name the number of copies kept per option and which options provide you with a secondary read access endpoint? If not, take a look at the corresponding Microsoft Learn module. Another way to protect your data is object replication. Object replication copies blobs asynchronously between a source and destination account, potentially across regions. This helps with latency optimization, cost optimization, and data distribution. For the exam, know the supported scenarios shown here, and remember that replication can be configured via the portal, PowerShell, or Azure CLI. Watch out for prerequisites and limitations when setting up replication rules. When planning your accounts, always choose the region closest to your users, and keep that also in mind for the exam. Object replication is a great solution to a question that doesn't restrict into region pairs for replication, for example. Storage Service Encryption, or SSE, is automatically enabled for all storage accounts, both new and existing. It uses 256-bit AES encryption and handles encryption and decryption transparently. For the exam, know the difference between Microsoft-managed keys and customer-managed keys. Customer-managed keys give you more control but require the Azure Key Vault. Always use HTTPS for key creation and distribution as a best practice as well. Besides the Azure portal, Azure Storage Explorer and AZ Copy are your two main data management tools. Storage Explorer is a GUI app for managing blobs, queues, tables, files, and more across multiple accounts. AZ Copy is a command line tool optimized for copying data to and from Azure Storage. For the exam, know which tool fits which scenario. AZ Copy supports Entra ID and SaaS token authentication, while Storage Explorer gives you a visual overview. It also supports an emulator for developing your solutions without access to Azure. And let's talk about Azure Files connectivity. Azure File Shares use the SMB protocol, which means port 445 must be open for Windows connections. You can connect from Windows, Linux, or Mac OS. Secure transfer requires SMB 3.0 encryption. For the exam, remember to check port connectivity first when troubleshooting file share access. You can find connection strings directly from the file share page in the Azure portal. This is a practical detail you would do well to remember so you can answer relevant questions in the exam. Configuring blob storage containers involves multiple operations, including creating a container, uploading blobs, and downloading blobs. These seem straightforward, but they are essential skills for the exam. Make sure you know the different access levels for containers like private, blob, and container access. Also ensure you understand how to configure blob properties and metadata. This might sound simple, but there are a lot of options available. Azure storage tiers are different levels that store data based on how frequently it's accessed, balancing storage costs versus access costs and performance. Azure Blob Storage has 4 tiers: hot, cool, cold, and archive. For the exam, make sure you know the differences. Hot has the highest storage cost but lowest access costs. Archive is the cheapest to store but takes hours to retrieve data and requires an 180-day minimum retention. For the exam, ensure that you remember the minimum retention periods, 30-day for cool, 90 for cold, 180 for archive. Switching to or from archive takes longer to process. And for the exam, remember what happens if you want to move the file before the minimum retention. Actually nothing, but you will pay the fee for the unused time. To automate this, you can also use lifecycle management policies. And if you're wondering how to protect your data from being lost, snapshots and soft delete protect your Azure Files data from corruption or accidental deletion. Snapshots are point-in-time, read-only copies that persist until you explicitly delete them. But soft delete lets you recover deleted file shares within a retention period of 1 to 365 days. For the exam, know that snapshot data is read-only and that soft delete retention limits are strictly 1 to 365 days. Soft delete is not only available for Azure Files, but also for blobs. Blob lifecycle management policies, as we mentioned previously, let you automate moving blobs to cooler tiers or deleting them based on the rules you define. This is huge for cost optimization. You can set conditions based on the age of blobs and apply rules to specific containers or paths. For the exam, understand the 3 rule types and how lifecycle policies interact with storage tiers. Automating tier transition is a real-world skill the exam values. Each blob represents a file, but that does not mean we only retain the latest version. Blob versioning captures the state of a blob each time it is modifying, assigning a unique version ID. Only one current version exists at a time, and promoting a previous version creates a new current version with a new ID. For the exam, know that keeping fewer than 1,000 versions per blob is recommended to avoid latency issues. Every write creates a new version, so understand the storage cost implications. In this domain, we cover everything regarding configuring access to storage, managing storage accounts, and working with Azure Files and blob storage. This domain is 15 to 20% of the exam, so make sure you're comfortable with SAS tokens, redundancy options, storage tiers, and lifecycle management. If you don't feel confident on these topics yet, revisit it before moving on to compute resources. Our third domain covers deploying and managing Azure Compute Resources. This includes ARM templates and bicep files, virtual machines, containers, and app services. At 20 to 25% of the exam, this is one of the heaviest domains. Expect questions on provisioning, configuring, scaling, and managing compute workloads. Let us break it down. Here is everything in the compute domain, including ARM templates, VM, containers, and apps that the exam might test you on. Remember, not all topics appear, but any of them could show up in a question in the exam. ARM templates are JSON files that define your infrastructure as code. For the exam, make sure you know the key elements, which is schema, content version, parameters, variables, functions, resources, and outputs. You should be able to interpret an ARM template, modify it, deploy resources using it, and export a deployment as a template. For the exam, make sure you understand the structure of each element, and that is more important than memorizing the exact syntax. Bicep is a domain-specific language that simplifies ARM template authoring. It's cleaner and more readable than JSON templates. For the exam, it is important to know how to interpret and modify bicep files, deploy resources with them, and compile bicep to ARM. Make sure for the exam you understand the key features like parameters, conditions, loops, and modules. Bicep is increasingly important in the Azure ecosystem, and this is reflected in the exam as well. Creating a VM involves selecting the right size, OS image, virtual network, subnet, and disk configuration. You also configure management options like backups, monitoring, and auto shutdown. For the exam, know the end-to-end VM creation flow through the portal, including advanced features like extensions and scripts. You should ensure you understand each configuration tab and its implications. Before you take the exam, it'd be good to practice it in a lab environment. VM sizes are organized into families based on workload type. For example, D series is general purpose, F series is compute optimized, E series is memory optimized, and so on. For the exam, familiarizing yourself with a letter naming convention and what each family is optimized for is really useful. You don't need to memorize every size, but you should be able to match workload requirements to the right VM family. For example, which VM would you use for a medium traffic server? Managing VM disks and configuring Azure Disk Encryption go hand in hand. To add a data disk, you select the VM, attach a new managed disks, and initialize it. The VM size determines how many data disks you can attach. For disk encryption, you create a key vault and then enable encryption on the disk. For the exam, it is good to know the steps for both adding disks and enable encryption and how they relate to the VM sizing. Availability sets ensure your VMs are not all subject to a single point of failure. Deploy multiple VMs across availability sets, separate application tiers into different sets, and combine them with load balancers. 2 or more instances in availability sets give you a 99.95% SLA. For the exam, understand update domains and fault domains and how they protect your workloads during maintenance and outages. And although not explicitly covered in the guide, make sure you understand how SLAs work, especially when they're combined for multiple applications. What is the difference between vertical and horizontal scaling? Vertical scaling changes the power of individual instances, while horizontal scaling changes the number of instances. Autoscaling triggers based on metric conditions over time. VM scale sets let you deploy and manage identical VMs that can automatically scale, and they can support up to 1,000 instances. For the exam, know the scaling types and their basic configuration options per service, because the types of scaling do not change, but how you apply them to each service, like scale sets or any other, might differ a little bit. Moving VMs between resource groups, subscriptions, or region is a common admin task. Moving between resource groups or subscriptions is straightforward, but cross-region moves may involve longer interruptions. For the exam, make sure you understand the impacts on uptime for each type of move and any dependent resources that must move with the VM. You might encounter this in scenario-based questions, so be prepared to take this into account when answering these questions in the exam. Azure Container Registry, or ACR, is a private container registry that stores and manages container images based on Docker Registry 2.0. It comes in 3 tiers, provides security features, and integrates with orchestration systems like Kubernetes. It is important for the exam to know the key use cases: scalable orchestration, integration with AKS or Azure Kubernetes Service, integration with App Service, Batch, and Service Fabric. You also need to know when to use ACR versus other image storage options for the exam. Azure Container Instances, or ACI, are the fastest way to run a container in Azure without managing VMs. They offer fast startup, public IP connectivity, hypervisor-level security, custom sizing, persistent storage, and virtual network deployment. If you are asked in the exam, know that ACI is best for quick, simple container workloads. For full orchestration and automatic scaling, Microsoft recommends AKS instead. So for the exam, know when to use which service if presented in a use case. Azure Container Apps, or ACA, provides a fully managed serverless platform for running microservices and containerized apps. This simplifies infrastructure management and handles container orchestration for you. Think of them as a middle ground between container instances and Kubernetes. It is important to know for the exam how ACA integrates both with Azure Container Registry and when to choose Azure Container Apps over Azure Container Instances or Azure Kubernetes Service based on your workload needs. Scaling containers in ACI and ACA is defined by limits, rules, and behavior. Limits set the minimum and maximum replica count. Rules define when to add or remove replicas based on HTTP, TCP, or custom metrics. This behavior combines rules and limits for final scaling decisions. For the exam, make sure you understand these three concepts and know that for full orchestration with automatic scaling, AKS is the recommended service. Have you clarified what are the benefits of using each of the container services yet? And what about hosting apps? An app service plan defines the compute resources for your web apps, which includes region, number of VMs, instances, and size of those instances. So when you create a plan in a region, all apps in that plan share those compute resources. Make sure you understand the relationship between the plan and the app or apps it hosts for the exam. You should know how to identify plans in an app service environment and how pricing is determined by the plan configuration so you can answer any relevant questions in the exam. App service scaling is also important and it comes in two flavors. Scale up, or vertical scaling, changes the plan, tier, and VM size, while scale out, or horizontal scaling, increases the number of VM instances. For the exam, it is important to know the three pricing tier categories: shared compute charges per CPU quota, dedicated compute charges per VM instance, and isolated charges per worker. For the exam, understand which tier supports which scaling option and the cost implications of each choice. Managing app services is very important. Remember, this is the Azure Administrator Associate exam. You might not develop the application, but you need to be able to decide and implement functions like creating the service, configuring deployment slots, securing it with Key Vault, setting up custom ID domain names with DNS, and so many other things. So for the exam, remember that deployment slot settings can be configured to stick to a slot and not swap. Each of these skills and tasks are important to know how you can implement them for the exam so you can answer the relevant questions. In this section, we covered ARM templates and bicep, VM creation, configuration, containers including ACR, ACI, ACA, and app services. This domain is 20 to 25% of the exam and contains so many acronyms. Make sure you are comfortable with deployment, automation, VM availability, container provisioning, and app service configuration. Even though not every item you see here will appear in your exam, any of them could be part of a question. Next to our fourth domain, which is implementing and managing virtual networking. This domain covers configuring and managing virtual networks, securing network access, and setting up name resolution and load balancing. Networking makes up 15 to 20% of the exam. Even if you do not work with networks daily, you need to understand these concepts to successfully pass the exam. Here is the full skills list for the exam for networking. It includes virtual networks, user-defined routes, service endpoints, and so much more. Each of these is a potential exam topic. Virtual networks are the backbone of Azure networking. A VNet is a logical representation of your network in the cloud, supporting hybrid scenarios and subnet segmentation. Public IPs come in standard SKUs for new deployments with dynamic or static allocation. For the exam, know how VNets enable secure communication between Azure resources, the internet, and even on-premises networks. Understand subnets, the role in segmentation, and how NSGs secure them. What about multiple networks? VNet peering connects two virtual networks seamlessly. When you create a peering on one VNet, the second configuration is added automatically. Both peering links must show a connected status. For the exam, know the settings like allow virtual network access, forwarded traffic, and gateway transit. Understanding peering is crucial because it comes up in cross-VNet communication scenarios very frequently. But sometimes we want to influence how we direct traffic. User-defined routes let you control how packets flow through your network. A route table contains rules that specify the next hop for traffic, which could be a gateway, another VNet, the internet, or a virtual appliance. Make sure you know how UDRs override default system routes and how IP forwarding works with network virtual appliances. This is how you force traffic through a firewall or inspection device, for example, if you get a relevant question in the exam. And once you configure everything, what now? Troubleshooting network connectivity is a practical skill you need to have for the exam. Common issues can include VMs unable to communicate with the same VNet, problems with secondary network adapters, or VMs that cannot reach the internet. For each scenario, know the resolution paths. For example, check inbound port rules, configure routing for secondary adapters, or fix network adapter states. Real-world troubleshooting scenarios can appear in the exam, and you need to know your options for resolution. Network security groups, or NSGs, filter traffic to and from Azure resources. They contain security rules that allow or deny traffic based on 5-tuple information: source, source port, destination, destination port, and protocol. NSGs can be associated with subnets or network interfaces, so for the exam, it is important to understand the default security rules for both inbound and outbound traffic, and know how rules are evaluated by priority. You might even get a little table, and you have to analyze and check what's going on and which rule is going to be allowed or denied. So make sure you practice before you take the exam. Application security groups, or ASGs, might sound similar to the network security groups, but they are completely different. ASGs let you group VMs and define security policies at the application level rather than the IP address. You can use ASGs in NSG rules to simplify administration as servers change IPs or new ones are added. For the exam, know the difference. NSGs filter network traffic between resources, while ASGs let you group machines logically for policy application. Both work together for effective security. Now let's talk about VMs and access. Azure Bastion provides secure RDP and SSH access to your VMs directly through the browser without needing a public IP on the VM. It is a fully managed platform as a service deployed in your VNet. For the exam, it's important to know the deployment architecture. Bastion sits in the VNet. You connect through any HTML5 browser, and the connection happens over TLS. No public IP exposure means a much smaller attack surface. Service endpoints and private endpoints both secure access to Azure Platform as a Service services, but they work very differently. Service endpoints route traffic over the Azure backbone and apply to all compute instances in the subnet, while private endpoints create a private IP in your VNet for the service. For the exam, know the configuration details, when to use its type, and their restrictions. This might be combined with many other topics and services on the exam. Azure DNS lets you host and manage domains using Azure infrastructure. It acts as the start of authority for your domain and supports features like private domains and alias record sets. For the exam, know the difference between Azure DNS and private DNS. Azure DNS is public-facing, while private DNS provides name resolution within and between VNets without custom solutions. Azure Load Balancer distributes incoming traffic across backend resources at layer 4. A public load balancer maps public IP addresses to private IPs and handles the internet traffic. An internal load balancer works with private IPs only, which is ideal for traffic within a VNet or multi-tier apps. For the exam, know both types, their use cases, and why load balancing improves scalability and availability for your resources. Troubleshooting load balancers follows a systematic approach, which is very important for you to know for the exam. You start by reviewing the issue, then determine which component is affected, like front-end IP, backend pool, routing rules, or VMs, and then identify the right diagnostic tool. Network Watcher and Health Probes are your go-to tools. Be ready for scenario-based questions in the exam where you need to diagnose why an application behind the load balancer might be unreachable. That is a great skill to practice for the exam and real-life scenarios. Let's recap the networking domain. We covered virtual network, subnet, peering, user-defined routes, NSGs, ASGs, Azure Bastion, service, and private endpoints. At 15 to 20% of the exam, networking is significant. So if anything is not clear to you, go back and review the relevant sections. We are now going into the fifth and final objective domain, monitoring and maintaining Azure resources. This covers monitoring with Azure Monitor and implementing backup and recovery. It is weighted at 10 to 15%, and while it is the smallest domain, do not ignore it, as every point counts in the exam. Backup and disaster recovery questions require precise knowledge of steps, tools, and configurations. Here's what the monitoring domain covers: interpreting metrics, configuring and querying logs, and so much more. All of these skills can be part of the exam, but not necessarily. You'll encounter all of them. Let's start with Monitor. Azure Monitor metrics give you real-time visibility into your resources. Make sure you know what agents need to be installed to collect metrics and understand common examples like CPU cycles and IOPS percentages. VM Insights let you monitor guest OS and workloads specifically. For the exam, understand the Azure Monitor architecture. Data sources feed into metrics and logs, which then drive alerts, dashboards, and even automated responses. And if you want to go above the retention of Azure Monitor, Log Analytics has greater retention, lets you create queries, build dashboards, and share them with your operations team. You can even monitor multiple subscriptions from a single dashboard. For the exam, know how to create a shared dashboard from a log query and understand that the Log Analytics dashboard helps visualize saved queries. Being able to correlate and share operational data is a great skill not just for the exam. Azure Monitor alerts notify you when metrics cross defined thresholds. You create alert rules with a scope, criteria, and logic, and then configure action groups to send email, text, or trigger webhooks and runbooks. For the exam, make sure you know the alert rule components: scope, details, including severity levels 0 through 4, and action groups. Make sure you understand how these pieces fit together and how essential it is for effective monitoring. Application Insights monitors request rates, response time, failure rates, dependencies, exceptions, page views, and custom events. It helps you proactively understand performance and reactively diagnose incidents. For the exam, make sure you remember the two key views: performance and failures. Application Insights connects to many tools and can monitor telemetry from both client and server sides. So this is your observability powerhouse. Network Watcher, as we mentioned previously, provides monitoring and diagnostic tools for Azure networking, while Connection Monitor specifically tracks connectivity between endpoints. To use Connection Monitor, you have to install agents, enable Network Watcher, create a monitor to analyze data, and set alerts. So make sure you review the Network Watcher capabilities and steps, including topology, connection monitoring, and performance monitoring, plus any service limits. And what about backups? Creating a recovery services vault is straightforward. You navigate to the backup center, select Vault, and provide subscription resource group vault name and region. The vault stores recovery points for your resources, so make sure you understand the cross-region restore options and how recovery services replicates workloads to secondary locations. Azure Backup Vault store backup data and support multiple workloads, so you need to know which these are for the exam, for example, on-premises, Azure VMs, and Azure file shares. When creating a vault, you can choose the backup redundancy. It is important to know the key benefits and remember RTO and RPO targets. Site Recovery provides continuous replication for Azure VMs and VMware, with replication as frequent as every 30 seconds for Hyper-V. Backup policies define the schedule and retention from your backups. So required parameters might include backup management, policy name, and more. Make sure you know all of these for the exam and understand that backup operates in the same region while site recovery targets a paired region. Performing backup and restore operations follows a clear process, so make sure you know what that is for the exam. Verify Azure settings and permissions, prepare the VM, create a recovery services vault, then enable VM replication. For the exam, you might get a scenario and need to troubleshoot based on these steps. Remember to review additional tasks, for example, checking admin permissions, ensuring sufficient resources in the target region, and verifying VMs have outbound connectivity and current root certificates. Setting up disaster recovery with Azure Site Recovery involves enabling replication for the VM, verifying settings, and clearing up resources. For the exam, expect questions that ask you to sequence steps correctly or to troubleshoot a misconfigured failover. Know the end-to-end flow from enabling replication to performing a test failover. Although there are a lot of options that depend on the company infrastructure, knowing the basic steps will help you apply them to any scenarios you encounter in the exam. A couple of other skills tested in the exam that you should keep in mind are the ones we see here. Configuring Azure Site Recovery for resources involves creating policy assignments, setting target properties, configuring remediation, and checking VM protection status. For backup reporting, know that Azure Backup integrates with Resource Graph, monitor alerts, monitor logs, and resource health. Built-in dashboards help monitor jobs and instances while custom reports analyze historical trends. That wraps up the monitoring and maintenance domain. We covered monitoring resources with Azure Monitor Metrics, Log Alerts, Application Insights, Network Watcher, and more. This domain may be the smallest at 10 to 50%, but do not skip it, as every point and every question counts in the exam. On top of this, backup and recovery questions require precise knowledge of steps and configurations, and they can be tricky sometimes if you get them in a question. Now you know exactly what to focus on before you sit for the AZ-104 exam. You have seen the 5 objective domains, the key topics within each, and the kinds of details that show up on test day. Before you schedule your exam, make sure you take advantage of the exam sandbox. Gives you a feel of the interface and question format, so there are no surprises. Also, do not skip the free practice assessment available right on the exam page. It's one of the best ways to gauge your readiness and pinpoint any last areas that need attention. You have the roadmap, now go put in the work and earn that Azure Administrator Associate certification. Thank you for joining us and good luck! You got this!